So I thought I would provide a quick overview of the Transportation and Climate Initiative. The agency's point person on this, as I expect many of you know, is the Deputy Secretary Peter Walk. He is actually at a TCI meeting today in New Jersey. Otherwise, he would be standing here giving this portion of the presentation. But look forward to sharing with you where we currently stand in this process that the state's been participating in for a little over a year now. I think first it's important to reflect on why focus on transportation emissions, and it's because they're really significant. The image on the left is for the U.S. as a whole, where you can see that emissions from transportation make up about 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions. In Vermont, it's over 40%. It really is the dominant source. Some of that's reflective of our clean energy work and profile, and some of that's reflective that we travel more than the average American in moving between our homes, our jobs, and some of the services that we all require. So the Transportation Climate Initiative actually extends back back to 2010. And has been staffed throughout that time. But in December 2018, there was a concerted push by 9 of the 12 states that originally were participating in the Transportation and Climate Initiative, announcing that we would go to that next level and spend the next year developing a cap and invest policy proposal. And 3 states, the ones that are shown in sort of that mint green color, New York, New Hampshire, and Maine, have been active in the TCI program from 2010, but didn't explicitly sign on to the work that's currently underway. That said, that they've continued to attend meetings and participate. So in some ways, it's a bit of a distinction without a difference. But that's why we say that there's 9 states plus DC that are formally participating in this evaluation of a cap and invest policy. So I think it's important, before we get into sort of the TCI piece, to talk for a moment about different types of pollution reduction programs. And I would put them into 3 large bins. First is command and control. I would argue that's a type of pollution reduction program my agency specializes in. We issue you a permit and expect you to achieve the goals of said permit. We are guaranteed through that sort of approach to get the reductions we're looking for, but oftentimes we recognize that they may come at a higher cost. That may not be the most efficient or effective way. Cap and trade is an attempt to get at some of that cost efficiency, and it establishes a shared outcome, a target for a sector without setting individual targets, and creates a market for trading pollution allowances. So still seeking those same pollution reductions, but doesn't make individual assignments. And acid rain and sulfur emission reductions throughout the 80s are probably the best and most well-known example of a cap and trade program. And then there are cap and invest programs, and that's the type of program that TCI is investigating right now. It's also what RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, uses. And this is one where facilities are purchasing allowances as opposed to having a pool of allowances that people argue or work over, and they're auctioned off. And so we are actually, in addition to achieving a pollutant reduction, we are actually generating a revenue source. And those auction proceeds are then reinvested to reduce consumer demand. So it's working on the supply side of the pollution as well as the consumer demand side. And just to get into a little bit more detail in RGGI. So RGGI was put in place in 2009. 9 northeastern and mid-Atlantic states participated in RGGI, and it required the major power plants in each jurisdiction to buy allowances at auction. The states then are investing the proceeds of those auctions into efficiency and other initiatives. Those efficiency initiatives are selected on a state-by-state basis. Those weren't prescribed regionally. And what we've seen is the net result is more than a 40% reduction in emissions at the lowest cost. You will hear from some that the changes in the natural gas market played no small role in achieving those 40% reductions. And in some ways that's an important factor, and in other ways it's not. It worked. It got us to the place we wanted to be. And I think the success is, frankly, also reflected in the fact that New Jersey, Virginia, and just within the last couple of months, Pennsylvania have announced their intentions to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which we think is fantastic. So the TCI program framework is not dissimilar to the RGGI program framework in terms of the type of approach that's being pursued. On October 1st, there was a memo put out, and it's available on the TCI website. It's just 4 pages, and would encourage you, if you're interested, to take a look at it, that gets at these key program elements in a bit more detail. It speaks to the applicability. So the TCI program would affect gasoline and on-road diesel only. So it's got a fairly limited universe. It talks about where the point of regulation would be. And in this case, it's state fuel suppliers. Sometimes I would refer to it for shorthand as tank farms, right? It's not each individual gas station. It's that point of origin for the fuel supply. It's talking about what the monitoring and verification framework would be for ensuring that we know exactly how much of those affected fuels are being distributed into each jurisdiction. And it's looking at market characteristics. There was a really important sort of safety valve within the RGGI program that's currently under evaluation, which would make available more allowances if something unforeseen happened to avoid a really significant price spike that wasn't anticipated in the models we're using to make decisions. And then it also includes equity, environmental justice, public participation considerations. And some of you may have had an opportunity to participate in a session. Peter has led a number of them around the state this summer and fall, collecting input. Certainly the rural character of Vermont is a challenge in thinking through exactly how this program would work. And Peter's also been engaged in conversations with New Hampshire and Maine in particular, who certainly share some of the same rural transportation challenges that we're faced with. So this is where we stand on the timeline, right? The regional policy framework is out. There's been a lot of work done this fall in each of the participating jurisdictions to gather public input. And a draft memorandum of understanding should be released before the end of the year. This draft memorandum of understanding is going to outline the anticipated reductions that the TCI program could achieve at a certain price point, and then outline a series of next steps. So there's a lot of unknowns out there. Many folks ask about the cost associated with TCI, and I think sort of the best sideboards we have available to us to consider are RGGI on one hand, which is about $5 a ton of carbon dioxide, and the Western Climate Initiative, or WCI, on the other side, which is about $18 a ton. Those roughly translate into what would be a 5 to 18 cent increase in the cost of a gallon of gasoline. That's not exact math, but probably close enough for where we stand today. So obviously, those different prices have markedly different impacts, particularly on those least able to afford them. And we don't know yet where the group is going to land. That MOU should be out by the end of the year, and then there's a considerable amount of time provided for folks to review and evaluate the MOU within their own jurisdictions. Our participation in the program, every state's participation in the program, does not wed them to signing on the dotted line. It just meant we wanted to be at the table, and I think we've been extremely well served in participating in those conversations. And then the idea would be by this time or slightly earlier than this next year, there would be a model rule made available to talk about how the proceeds of those auctions might be utilized, so that even though the actual use of the proceeds is varied depending from state to state based on state priorities, I think it's also important that there's a consistent framework across all of the jurisdictions. And as currently envisioned, program implementation would begin in early 2022. So that was a high and quick level overview of TCI, and would welcome your questions.
Hi. Could you talk about all of our fossil fuel comes from out of state. And so, as I understand it, a big chunk of that is New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and all of them. So 3 different states. So what happens, let's say, if Massachusetts and New York are in, but New Hampshire is not? Can you just help us understand that? Similarly, Montreal, I think, is a state.
You're right, and that's one of the pieces that my understanding is folks are still working through, because I think it gets further complicated. It's not just the sort of the place where those fuel supplies come into the Northeast, but it's then, would you load up a single tanker truck that might conceivably deliver fuel moving from the Port of Albany to somewhere in upstate New York as well as in Bennington? And how would you separate those distinctions? So that's one of the sort of the core areas of work that's underway, is trying to think about the mechanics, frankly, of how that would be accommodated to the extent different jurisdictions opt in or opt out of ultimately participating.
As it happens, all 3 of us missed. Was it 5 to 13 cents?
5 to 18. And that's really just using RGGI as the one end and then the Western Climate Initiative as the other end, as our best benchmarks. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being with us today and for presenting this information. And I have a question, but it may not be a question that you can answer here immediately. From our experience with RGGI, the way that Vermont got ahead and sort of won out in the RGGI scenario was by focusing on efficiency, which is the less of that fuel that you use, the more money your residents are going to save in this cap and invest model. And so I'm just curious, since there's been a lot of push from the legislature as well as some from the administration to help Vermonters get into more fuel-efficient vehicles, what do we need to be doing now, between now and 2022, when the program's up and running, to really game that system and to get Vermonters ahead on the efficiency front?
I think Dan is going to talk about some of the work we're doing to help folks transition into electric vehicles. And so maybe to the extent he doesn't answer your question in his part of the presentation, we can come back to that at the end. I think, just building off of a piece of what you said, the decisions about what those investments are, I don't think can be taken distinct and separate from the evaluation of the cost proposal, right? It needs to be what that surcharge would be on a gallon of gas compared to the value proposition offered by investments we might make. And I think that is a really important piece of this conversation and dialogue, and one that's going to be state-specific once we get this regional architecture sort of ironed out and know what the space is that we're potentially operating in.
Thank you for the presentation. Also, I attended one of Peter Walk's tours around the state and found them very helpful. I was curious if we will receive any updates on, one of the questions that was asked was, where would we like to see the funding from this? Where would we like to see it go towards? I was wondering if we will see some sort of analysis of those responses from the tours around the state, or if you have a general overview of what people were saying.
I don't have that general overview, and I believe Peter is assembling that information. As I say, I think it would be hard to view any cost proposal absent understanding what the proposed investments are, and so by necessity, those 2 pieces of the conversation will need to move forward together.
Good morning, Madam Secretary. Thanks for your presentation on TCI. I have a question. I'm trying to understand a recent statement by the governor and how to match that up with today's presentation. So on the 14th, he had noted that in a press conference, it said, "Suffice to say, my feelings haven't changed on a carbon tax. If TCI is that at all, I'm not supportive of it." And so at heart, TCI is around raising revenues to support programs to help us make that transition. Can you reconcile those two? I'm just trying to make sure I have a clear picture of how the administration plans to move on this.
Sure. And I think right back to that point about where those investments get made is really the key to that conversation. A carbon tax doesn't necessarily guarantee that we're making investments that would be meaningful on the consumer demand side, right? It's generating revenue without a commitment to where those revenues need to go. And so I do think it's those two conversations need to move forward together. Certainly, the administration has a strong desire to see investments that are made with an eye towards economic development and affordability, and thinking through how the proceeds of a cap and invest type system under TCI could be used to bring down consumer demand for fossil fuels, but at the same time promote affordability and economic development initiatives is going to be a key part of this discussion going forward, I think.
Can I follow there? So if we all, I think, agree on the desirability of how to make those wise investments for all the same shared reasons, if we don't have the funds coming in to make those investments, then the program is hamstrung. So that's the conundrum I see in the kind of statement that says we aren't allowed to raise revenues if they amount to a carbon tax.
So we're going to take one more question and then to go into Anthea's and Dan's continuation of this subject.
Thank you. This is for both the first presentation and this presentation. How are we tracking, I think we should be tracking, how much money is going back into the Vermont economy in small business, agribusiness, car dealerships? You know, a lot of this we're hearing about how much this is going to cost. I think it would be very helpful to look at how much this is going back into our economy, and also what should we be doing as a state to gear up the smaller businesses that might be able to participate in this. This is a $48 million economic development package going into the state. Thank you.
Yes, and we, particularly in the face of clean water, all of those investments are being made on the ground, in the ground, so to speak, here in Vermont. And so that economic impact is real. Frankly, one of the concerns that's been expressed to me about the 3-acre stormwater permit is the capacity within our engineering community to actually do the design work that's required to have those projects ready to go into the ground. So workforce development initiatives, and that's something, again, the administration has spent a lot of time and energy promoting, thinking about those particular sectors within the Vermont economy where we are capacity constrained, and how we can help get more people doing that sort of work are all really important considerations. Point well taken.
My name's Anthea Dexter-Cooper. I'm a new face for some of you. I joined Ledge Council last year. I mostly staff transportation matters. I'm joined by Dan Dutcher. He is the Senior Environmental Policy Manager for the Agency of Transportation. As I go through my presentation, which is on what I'm saying are the lowercase transportation climate initiatives, not to be confused with the Transportation and Climate Initiative of Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states that you just heard about from Secretary Moore, Dan is going to be politely interjecting to give you an update on some of what the Agency of Transportation has been worked on in response to the lowercase transportation climate initiatives in the T-bill from last session. So one of the things that's really important when you look at the T-bill is you need to acknowledge the fact that this binder, which is the Agency of Transportation's proposed transportation program, is basically clipped to the back of it. And Section 1A of the T-bill always adopts this program, except, of course, as the General Assembly chooses to change it. That means that there could be a lot of transportation climate initiatives that are in this binder that you wouldn't know about if you didn't look at the text of the act, what's printed in the journal, what's printed in the calendar. I have links to this. If you have the time and wish to peruse it, all of this is available either on the General Assembly's website or the Agency of Transportation's website. One of the things that was new this year in the T-bill was to save people from needing to look in the binder to see these transportation climate initiatives was a summary section. So this summary section, which is Section 2, I'm going to read some of this to you, says, "This act includes the state's fiscal year 2020 transportation investments intended to reduce transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, reduce fossil fuel use, and save Vermont households money in furtherance of the policies articulated in statute 19 VSA Section 10B and the goals of the Comprehensive Energy Plan, known as the CEP, and to satisfy the executive and legislative branches' commitments to the Paris Agreement climate goals." So if you're not going to read the transportation program, read Section 2. If you're not going to read Section 2, I have some excerpts up on the next 2 slides. Don't need to read this now. I'm not going to read any of this to you. Dan is going to talk a little bit about what the agency has been working on with the first slide, and the second slide we'll be touching on throughout the rest of the presentation.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Dan Dutcher. I'm just going to give you a few highlights of some of the things on this slide to give you an idea of progress that's being made. St. Johnsbury, 47 spaces are being constructed. Construction began in the fall, and the park and ride facility is partially open, and construction is expected to be completed this spring. In addition, planning and design is underway at 8 additional park and ride facilities. Moving along to bike and ped projects. Sidewalks have been constructed in Castleton, Fairhaven, Heinsberg, and Stowe. In addition, construction of sidewalks and bike lanes have been completed in Manchester. That was coordinated with a V-Trans paving project. Also, further improvements to the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail were completed between Sheldon and Swanton, and also an upgrade to the aggregate surface on close to 20 miles of the Delaware and Hudson Rail Trail in southwestern Vermont is under contract, and most of that work will take place this spring. And if you want details, there's a handout that has a little more information on it, and you can always contact me afterwards, and I can put you in touch with the right people to get you all the information you want. In public transit, 6 electric buses will be delivered in the next few months to 3 different transit providers across the state. Electric transit is a maturing technology, and I think we've gotten to a kind of catch point, and we're going to start seeing more and more of this. And it's a great way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve the experience of public transit. In addition, 2 small shuttle buses, which are called cutaways, are coming to Montpelier, and those are awaiting FTA approval. Also, the Montpelier Transit Center has now been completed, and that is currently serving as the city's transit hub. With regard to rail projects, 2 things to highlight. There's the Western Corridor Amtrak project. Grade crossing work has been completed. 1 station platform has been completed, and 1 station platform is currently in design. Amtrak service is anticipated to begin in 2021 to Burlington, and right now the train ends in Rutland. In addition, design work is underway for the upgrade of 31 rail bridges along the Western Corridor between Rutland and Hoosick, New York, and that was funded with a $20 million build grant. So I think that's what I've got on that slide. Okay.
This is some of the other language that was included in Section 2. We got a little bit on uppercase TCI in the lower left-hand corner, or right-hand corner, rather. I'm going to be talking about the state vehicle fleet reports and the incentive repair programs along with Dan later on in the presentation, so we're going to skip the rest of the slide. So we're dealing a lot with electric vehicles throughout Act 59 and in general when we're talking about what's going on with the transportation sector. We love to define things. So a plug-in electric vehicle is really simply a vehicle that you plug into electricity, not a super useful definition to just rearrange the words. The key thing for a plug-in electric vehicle is that it can draw recharge energy from a source off the vehicle. That will then include in our bucket of PEVs Plug-in electric vehicles includes both a motor vehicle that can only be powered by an electric motor, that's your battery electric vehicle, and a motor vehicle that can be powered by an electric motor drawing current from a rechargeable energy storage system, but also has an onboard combustion engine. This is going to be your plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. Thought it'd be helpful to have some examples. The first ever 2020 Corolla Hybrid is not a plug-in electric vehicle. Hybrids have a battery that is charged by regenerative braking and the internal combustion engine in the vehicle. The battery in the first ever 2020 Corolla Hybrid cannot draw recharge energy from a source off the vehicle. Not a plug-in electric vehicle. The Prius. This technology has been around for 2 decades. Not a plug-in electric vehicle. The 2020 Prius Prime. This is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. This would meet the definition for a plug-in electric vehicle. Some tells for when it's an actual PEV, and it's hard to see on the slide, but you'll see it's listed with an MPGE. That's a miles per gallon equivalency. You're also getting the MPGE up in the triple digits. Not going to get that from a hybrid yet. That is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. The RAV4 Hybrid, not a plug-in electric vehicle. Both of Chevy's vehicles, the Volt and the Bolt, are plug-in electric vehicles under our definition. If you are like me and you can never remember the difference between the two, B is for battery. The Bolt EV is a battery electric vehicle, whereas the Volt is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. Both of these meet the definition for plug-in electric vehicle. Also adding to Title 30, a definition for electric vehicle supply equipment. Electric vehicle supply equipment is the technical term for a charging station. Electric vehicle supply equipment is a device or system that transfers energy to the plug-in electric vehicle. In this definition, we are also saying what needs to happen if the electric vehicle supply equipment is going to be available to the public. These are some consumer protections that we've added. EVSE available to the public shall be located at a publicly available parking space, disclose all charges at the point of sale, and provide multiple payment options. There's some language in subdivision C that talks about membership and organizations. This means that if you, for example, were a member of ChargePoint, to use as an example, you could be given a discount, but the ChargePoint cannot prohibit people from using their electric vehicle supply equipment if it's going to be made available to the public. So the 2018 T-bill told the Public Utility Commission to prepare a report and look into a number of issues related to electric vehicles. One of the things that the PUC did in the middle of last session was they came back with a recommendation on language that would take jurisdiction over electric vehicle supply equipment away from the PUC and the Department of Public Service. This is language that was worked on extensively in both transportation committees, and the key thing is that if you are not otherwise regulated by the PUC, just because you are owning, operating electric vehicle supply equipment doesn't mean that you are then, just because of that, subject to PUC jurisdiction. Another thing that this definition does that's really important is it says that if an electric vehicle supply equipment is charging by the kilowatt hour, that doesn't make them an electric distribution utility. In most instances, it is only the electric distribution utilities that can sell electricity, and that's why you might have been seeing, prior to this language coming into effect, a lot of charging stations that were charging by the time that you spent plugged into the station. This was to get around the fact that the charging station, if it wasn't being maintained and operated by a distribution utility, shouldn't have been charging for electricity. You will now be seeing more charging stations charging by the kilowatt hour. I have heard anecdotally that there were a lot of charging stations that were charging by the kilowatt hour before this language came into effect, but now it will be in accordance with our laws. So just because we are taking jurisdiction of electric vehicle supply equipment away from the PUC does not mean that this will not be regulated. Sections 31 and 32 add electric vehicle supply equipment available to the public to the definition of weights and measures, which means that this will be, and I'm using will be for a particular reason, regulated by the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. will be, because this language is not effective until the earlier of January 1, 2021, or 6 months after the National Institute of Standards and Technology adopts code on electric vehicle supply equipment. As it has been explained to me, it is much harder to confirm that a charging station is spitting out 1 kilowatt-hour of electricity than it is to determine if a gas pump is spitting out 1 volume of gasoline. So NIST needs some time to work on that before we're asking AG to regulate it. The General Assembly will stay up to date. They're required to report back on NIST's status in adopting the code and making a recommendation on an annual licensing fee for EVSE available to the public. So in addition to seeing charging stations that were charging by time, you also might have seen charging stations that were completely free. Some of these charging stations were owned and operated by state agencies and departments. And as I have been told, one of the reasons why they weren't charging was because you, the General Assembly, set fees. Agencies and departments couldn't do it on their own. This section, Section 37, adds language to Title 32 that will let agencies and departments that own or control electric vehicle supply equipment establish, set, and adjust fees. There are some parameters, though. The agencies or departments can charge fees that are less than costs, to cover costs, or equal to the retail rate charged. The middle one, to cover costs, doesn't need much explanation. That's what fees typically do. The other two need a little bit more explanation, and your Transportation Committee has spent a lot of time looking at this language. At less than costs, there could be instances, the example given by the Agency of Transportation is the slow or trickle charge that's just like plugging your car into an outlet at, for example, a park and ride, where it would be prohibitively expensive to figure out a way to meter and charge for the consumption of that electricity, and the electricity that's been using if someone drives to the park and ride, parks their car, takes the bus to Montpelier, and comes back 8 hours later, that would be negligible. So this permits them to charge less than their costs. The third one, equal to the retail rate charged, that's to account for the fact that the state, by installing electric vehicle supply equipment, would in essence be competing with for-profit entities that are owning and operating their own charging stations. One of the barriers to why there hasn't been more widespread electric vehicle adoption is range anxiety. And that's when you're worried that if you're going on a trip, you're not going to make it to your final destination because there aren't going to be enough charging stations along the way. This language is designed to account for the fact that if the state is charging less than the retail rate, it might mean that other entities are not choosing to install electric vehicle charging stations. And I think Dan has a little bit on this one as well. Or not? Not to put you on the spot?
No, I can. Buildings and General Services is coming up with fee structures and protocols for state owner-controlled chargers. And that's in the works, and when they get that done, they'll distribute a memo to the other agencies, so we're all essentially marching to the same drum. So we're working on it.
Going a lot faster now. Oh. And if you think this is all a terrible idea, that BGS shouldn't be able to be doing it, the General Assembly will need to look at this again. This language, the entire section, is repealed after 3 years on July 1 of 2022. So expect to hear more about this. Section 34, along with the big bill, the appropriations bill, directs the Agency of Transportation in consultation with some other named entities to establish and administer 2 programs, 2 incentive and repair programs pursuant to specific parameters, and gives it a $2 million appropriation. I have a little cheat sheet up here that's telling you what the established parameters in session law are for the 2 different programs, what vehicles it applies for, who is eligible, what the voucher amount is if a voucher amount is established, and how much needs to be spent on that incentive program. This is just the skeletal framework that the General Assembly told the Agency of Transportation to go forth and follow in establishing and administering the program. And Dan is going to talk a bit about what the agency has been working on with respect to these programs.
Okay, thank you. There are actually 3 programs, if you get your eyes oriented to the columns. On the left, there's the Electric Vehicle Incentive Program for new plug-in electric vehicles, and then the column on the right has a high miles per gallon used vehicle purchase incentive, and then to the far right, there's an emissions repair program. The Agency of Transportation got right on this after the transportation bill passed, and in Section 34, $150,000 was set aside to administer these programs. Our plan was to work directly with Capstone Community Action Agency for the programs on the right, and then to solicit bids from a third-party contractor to handle the program on the left, the new PEV incentive program. One contractor got back to us, and the bid came in at $250,000. Remember, we have $150,000 total, and Capstone initially came in at $350,000 to run these programs. So we were immediately way over budget. And what we decided to do was work with Capstone, and they're enthusiastic about doing this, and they've been flexible. So they are going to run these programs on the right with the assistance of the Department of Motor Vehicles and VTrans and the Agency of Natural Resources. And we have diverted the entire $150,000 to Capstone for that purpose, which left us with nothing for the program on the left. And we had 2 options. One was to scrape up some money to see if we could pay a third-party contractor. We probably could have talked them down a little bit, but we were looking at, a couple $100,000 to get this going. Then the idea came up that we could work with the state's electric distribution utilities. All of them already have incentive programs on their own, and at least some of them expressed some enthusiasm about doing this. So we set about to do that, and I think we're making pretty good headway. We have the program elements figured out and program guidelines. We also are contracting with VEIC, which runs Drive Electric Vermont, to assist with this. They're going to help with consumer outreach and record keeping and marketing and that kind of thing. And we found $50,000 to do that. The electric distribution utilities are going to be helping us out at no cost. So the challenge has become to get into contracts with the 7 distribution utilities, no-cost contracts, which all have to look the same. And, we're getting a lot of different feedback from the different utilities. One of them, VIPSA, represents 11 municipal utilities. And at this point, I think we're very close to getting this figured out. I don't see any sort of organic type obstacles, deal breaker type issues, but there are a lot of details, including a lot of little niggly things, tax issues and paperwork and who's going to be doing what. So we I think are still hoping to launch next week. I'm not sure if that's going to happen or exactly how long this is going to take. So all I can tell you is that we're on it, and we'll stick with it, and we will eventually get this up and running.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about cars, and that is in connection with the state vehicle fleet. The Commissioner of Buildings and General Services is responsible for the state's vehicle fleet. This is addressed in both Title III and Title 29. Section 40, 41, and 42 changes what the makeup of that state vehicle fleet is to be. We're amending 29 VSA, Section 903G, to address both the purchase and the lease of vehicles for the state fleet, and then requiring, to the maximum extent practicable, that all of those purchased and leased vehicles be hybrids and plug-in electric vehicles. So if you go back a bunch of slides, all the cars that I had on the bottom would meet this. But acknowledging that it might not be possible, given the cars that are currently on the market, to have them all be hybrids and plug-in electric vehicles. So we are setting a 50% floor. So at least 50% of them need to be hybrids and plug-in electric vehicles. Commissioner of BGS gets to have that floor for 2 years, and then that is changing to 75%. So after 2 years, on July 1, 2021, 75% of the vehicles that are purchased for the fleet that's run by BGS need to be hybrids and plug-in electric vehicles. And then in Section 42, we're just amending Title III to match. The T-bill this year also addressed public transit funding. So Section 19 amends language in Title 24 to be consistent with current practice. The Agency of Transportation was under the impression that some language had been repealed that had a pretty complicated formula, so they were giving out public transit funding under a competitive grant program. They are going to continue doing that. Now the practice will match the statute, and that competitive grant program will continue to follow the public transportation policy goals set forth in Section 5083. So what are those public transit goals? I'm sorry this is small. You can read this at your leisure. But given the opportunity, you guys decided to change around those policy goals a little bit. They are no longer in precedent order. All of the goals carry whatever weight the goals carry. You added in expanding public transit service in rural areas and increasing ridership statewide as one of the goals, and specified that decreasing greenhouse gas emissions is part of what congestion mitigation accomplishes. A lot of reports in the T-bill this year. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but it's a summary, this slide and the next slide, of the 6 reports that relate to our lowercase TCI. I've got who's supposed to do the report, a blurb about it, when it's due, if it's already been filed, a link to the report, and what committees it's due to. The reports cover methods to increase public transit ridership in Vermont, the costs to upgrade the state-owned track between Barre and Montpelier to meet commuter rail standards, an annual evaluation of the incentive and repair programs established in Section 34, if an incentive is given out in a given year, an evaluation of whether to establish a program to provide repair services for income-eligible Vermonters if their vehicle fails the onboard diagnostic part of the annual inspection, a PUC tariff design report that is a follow-up to their June 27, 2019 report. I've also included the link to the docket there so you can see all of the public comments that have been filed if you have many, many hours on hand. This report is expected later this month, and a report on whether to establish a fee-bait program, an analysis of funding sources for the incentive programs established in Section 34, and how to hit the PEV goals in the Comprehensive Energy Plan, the CEP. And Dan, I think you wanted to talk about some of the reports on this slide.
I can just tell you that everything is on track. Section 20 report, methods to increase public transit, the study's in draft stage. That will soon be forwarded to stakeholders for review and comment, and then submitted to the legislature by the January 15th deadline. Section 20A, report on state-owned railroad line between Montpelier and Barre. That study has been completed and submitted to the transportation committees. Section 34A4, the annual evaluation of the incentive and repair programs. I talked about that a few minutes ago. We won't have anything to report on that because nothing has been paid out this year, and I believe the statute says that we have to report every year in which incentives have been paid out. So that's not going to happen. Next slide is Section 46. The vehicle fee-bait funding report, that's been finished and completed, and that's quite interesting. It gives maybe 4 or 5 different options on how to do a fee-bait program.
Okay, last slide between you and lunch. Sections 12 and 13 authorize the Agency of Transportation to accept approximately $22 million in federal grants. $12 $20 million in the Better Utilizing Investments to Leverage Development, the BUILD grant, and the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements, or the CRISI grant, $2 million for that. Dan has talked a little bit about some of the projects the agency has been working on with rail, but all of this money will go to rail. And then finally, Section 17 amends language in Title 19 to clarify that town highway aid, which is the annual appropriation that's distributed to towns based on the length of Class 1, 2, and 3 town highways, can also be used to establish and maintain sidewalks. I'm saying this as a clarification because I think since the money could go to the construction, improvement, and maintenance of highways, it would have included sidewalks, but since the statute already called out bicycle routes, it was decided to also include sidewalks there as well. We have finished a little bit ahead of schedule. Dan and I can stick around to answer questions now. We're also happy to stay for a little bit if you want to come up afterwards and ask us any questions.
This may really be a question about jurisdiction issues or whether the legislature versus the Public Service Board. I got a very timely letter from a constituent yesterday about a conflict between our trying to incentivize electric vehicles and electric utility requests currently pending about net metering. And her real point is that for our dispersed population, she says particularly for commuters and seniors, that adoption of EVs really and plug-in hybrids have to include viability for home charging. And she and her husband put in solar panels with the idea of reducing electric usage and investing in a plug-in hybrid EV when it comes time to trade in their car. They're on a rural road and are retirees, so a plug-in at home makes the most sense. But they've looked at the, if the rate change and the reduced net metering credits go into effect, it would basically make it not economically feasible to enable charging a vehicle. So we have, I think we have a conflict in policy right now for viability of what we're trying to incentivize.
Yeah, this is an issue that's being looked into. It is a very timely email that you got from your constituent. That PUC report that's due December 15th is addressing net metering and net metering credits as it relates to electric vehicle supply equipment. So lots of people are looking into this, and it'll be interesting to see what the PUC says there and if there's something that the legislature needs to do to address it.